We're going to transition now to our next presenter. His name is Abner Dean. So Abner, we had many paper proposals that came in, and then out of those proposals, we selected the papers being presented. And Abner is the only undergraduate student from CCC who had his proposal accepted. He's also the president of the Fellowship Student Ambassadors at CCC, and he's an all-around nice guy. So let's give it up for Abner Dean.
Well, shalom, everyone. Shalom. So before I begin, I would like to start off by reading Genesis chapter 17, verses 7 to 8. And I'll give you context here. This is God talking to Abraham. I will confirm my covenant that is between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations. It is a permanent covenant to be your God and the God of your offspring after you. And to you and your future offspring, I will give the land where you are residing, all of the land of Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. May God add his blessing to the reading. In the Old Testament, God made a promise to Abraham, who is the forefather of the Jewish people. God promised Abraham that his descendants would have permanent possession over the land of Canaan, which is all of the land in the Levant region of the Middle East that is between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. This area of the Levant region is known in Hebrew as Eretz Israel, which means the land of Israel. Today, there is a modern-day country in this area, which is the Jewish and democratic state of Israel. When Israel was created in 1948, the surrounding Arab nations waged a brutal war of aggression against Israel in order to annihilate it. This war was the first Arab-Israeli War of 1948, and the war resulted in Israel winning and defending its existence in the Middle East. The Arab world was furious, and in the year of 1967, the Arab countries of Jordan, Syria, and Egypt again decided to wage another war to push Israel and the Jewish people living there into the brink of extinction. This war was the Six-Day War of 1967, and as a result of this war, Israel not only saved itself from being annihilated, but also obtained the regions of Judea and Samaria from Jordan, which many of us know as the West Bank, the Golan Heights from Syria, and the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. In other words, Israel was truly victorious and obtained its historic and biblical land. Today, the state of Israel is in a bitter conflict with the Arabs who live in the regions of Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. Many of the Arabs who live in these areas aggressively demand that Israel should relinquish their claim to all of these areas so that they can create an Arab country of their own known as Palestine. And many of these Arabs identify themselves as Palestinians. There are even certain Arabs and certain Muslims who strongly believe that the Jewish people should leave all of the land of Israel and should just give it to the Arabs. The European Union and the United Nations have expressed their desire to see the creation of a Palestinian state within these areas. But we need to ask ourselves the question, is this really right? Is it right to create a Palestinian state? Is it right to evict all of the Jewish residents who live in Judea and Samaria so that the Arabs can create their own country? The idea to create a Palestinian state is a problematic idea, and thus we need to oppose it. We need to oppose it, both Jews and Christians. Firstly, it is immoral and unjust to advocate the creation of a Palestinian state. Secondly, a Palestinian state would be a security threat to Israel. And thirdly and finally, not only will it be a security threat to the state of Israel, but it will also be a security threat to its neighbors. So many of you will hear this a lot. Those who support the two-state solution will often say that it is morally correct to give the Arabs of these areas their own country. The truth, however, is that there are many reasons why the creation of a Palestinian state is immoral. The first reason is that many of the early leaders of Palestinian nationalism, many of the early leaders of the Palestinian movement, were devout adherents to the ideology of Arab fascism, which was strongly influenced and inspired by aspects of Italian fascism and Nazism. In fact, many of the political figures in the Arab world developed connections with both the Nazi regime in Germany and the fascist regime in Italy, and as a result, many of the Arab fascist and nationalist movements that came before and after World War II drew inspiration from both Nazism and Italian fascism. And one of these Arab leaders who was so inspired by Nazism and Italian fascism was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem named Hajj Amin Al-Husseini. Now, as an Arab fascist, Hajj Amin Al-Husseini hated the fact that Jews from Europe and Jews from other parts of the Middle East were immigrating to what was then known as the British Mandate of Palestine. And he was strongly against the Balfour Declaration, which was issued in 1917. Now, the Balfour Declaration was a proclamation created by the British government which declared that they would create a Jewish homeland within the British Mandate of Palestine. He was against this because he simply believed that the Middle East belonged to only Arab Muslims, and any Jewish presence in the Middle East, whether in the form of a country or whether simply Jews living in the Middle East, was a threat to Islam and a threat to the Arabs. As a result of this, Hajj Amin al-Husseini worked closely with the Nazi regime to promote aspects of Nazism within the Arab world. He in fact blended many of these aspects of Nazism with Arab nationalism and Islamic jihadism. On April the 3rd of 1941, al-Husseini helped fellow Arab fascist in Iraq, Rashid Ali al-Ghalani, to establish an Arab fascist government within Iraq, which was allied with the Axis powers during the height of World War II. This ultimately led to the Anglo-Iraqi War, in which the British and Allied forces waged a war against the Arab fascist government in Iraq. And towards the end of the Anglo-Iraqi War, when the Arab fascist regime was losing, the government decided to conduct a brutal pogrom, brutal lynching raid against the Jewish population in Baghdad, killing over 600 Jews, destroying 911 Jewish homes, and pillaging 586 Jewish businesses. Today, we know this pogrom to be known as Farhud. The Grand Mufti eventually came to Berlin, where he built relationships with Adolf Hitler and the Nazi establishment. And if you type his name on Google, you'll see a lot of pictures of him with Hitler and with Heinrich Himmler as well. The Nazi-controlled media in Germany praised Hajj Amin al-Husseini as a champion of Arab liberation against the British, the Jews, and their allies. In Germany, the Grand Mufti had a meeting with Adolf Hitler, where they shared with each other their hatred against the Jewish people and their desire to annihilate them. Now, many historians will argue that Hajj Amin al-Husseini was the founder of the Palestinian movement. He was the ideological father of what we know as Palestinian nationalism. And many of the ideas that were espoused by the Grand Mufti were adopted by the PLO and by other Palestinian political groups today. In many ways, the political life of Hajj Amin al-Husseini have become symbols of Palestinian nationalism. His views have become part and parcel of the Palestinian movement. To simply advocate for the creation of a Palestinian state is advocating the creation of a country whose political rulers derive all of their political views from a man who was a fascist, an ardent anti-Semite, and a Nazi sympathizer. And that man was Hajj Amin al-Husseini. Creating a country whose political leaders are inspired by a fascist is immoral. Creating a Palestinian state would be an insult to the Jews in Baghdad who died and suffered during the Farhud pogrom, which was supported by the Grand Mufti, by the way. It would also be an insult to the 6 million Jews who died in the Holocaust because the Grand Mufti was a Nazi supporter. The idea to create a Palestinian state is also immoral because a future Palestinian state would have political parties like Hamas and the Islamic Jihad movement governing it. Hamas does not believe in having any sort of peaceful relation with the state of Israel. They believe in destroying Israel only to replace it with a theocratic Islamic state. Likewise, the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine also believes in no peaceful relations with Israel and also seeks to replace Israel with a theocratic Islamic state. The question must be asked, which is why these Palestinian political groups hate Israel so much. The answer is the same reason why radical Muslims in countries like Pakistan, Iraq, and Iran persecute Christians and other religious minorities. Now, this part is a very chilling part of the paper. The charter of Hamas is explicit with anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and is also very explicit with quotations that degrade non-Muslims. Hamas also believes in the expulsion of all Jews from the Middle East. Now, this is actually really chilling. The 7th article within the Hamas charter adds a verse from the Hadith, which states that all Jews will be killed on the Islamic Day of Judgment. So bear with me, this is a very chilling quote from the Hadith, and I'll be reading it. So this is what the Hadith states. On the Day of Judgment, the Day of Judgment will not come until Muslims fight the Jews, when the Jew will hide behind stones and trees. The stones and trees will say, "O Muslim, O Abdullah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Only the garkat tree, evidently a certain kind of tree, will not do that because this is one of the trees of the Jews, whatever that means. The 28th article of the Hamas Charter declares Israel and Zionism to be an enemy of Islam. It ends by stating that Israel, Judaism, and the Jewish people are a threat to Islam and the Muslim people. Now, the 31st article states that non-Muslims must live under Islamic sovereignty. Therefore, non-Muslims aren't allowed to have any sort of self-determination. In short, the Charter of Hamas seeks to push Israel and the Jewish people into extinction and to subjugate non-Muslims like myself and like many of us under Islamic rule as only second-class citizens. Ultimately, the reason these Palestinian political groups hate Israel so much is simply because of the fact that Israel is a non-Muslim nation that is successful and thus a symbolism of non-Muslim self-determination in the Middle East. The idea of non-Muslims having self-determination and being successful is a concept that threatens radical Muslims. Radical Muslims in Pakistan often falsely accuse Christians of committing blasphemy against Islam in order to prevent them from climbing up in Pakistani society. In other words, the Muslim extremists that persecute Christians in Pakistan, they persecute them if they're more successful compared to them. When the Islamist terrorist group ISIL or ISIS, whichever name you want to call them, when they invaded northeastern Iraq in the year of 2014, many Iraqi Christians fled their homes and found refuge in the city of Baghdad. The remaining Christian and Yazidi population that stayed in northeastern Iraq suffered the most immense persecution, which included the horrific enslavement and rape of Yazidi women. The Muslim radicals in Pakistan, the ISIS terrorist group, and the Palestinian leadership are no different from each other. They have a lot in common. The Islamist terrorist group refuses to have peace with Israel because Israel is a non-Muslim country. The radical Muslims, they persecute Christians and other religious minorities in Pakistan because they are non-Muslims. ISIS raped, destroyed, and pillaged many Christian and Yazidi communities in Iraq because they are non-Muslims. To advocate for the creation of a Palestinian state is to advocate for the creation of an Islamic state that seeks no peace with Israel, no recognition of Israel, and no negotiations with Israel because they view Israel as a nation of infidels. The creation of a Palestinian state would only empower radical Muslims around the world. And I want you guys to think about this. It is no coincidence that many of the countries that don't recognize Israel's existence are Muslim-majority countries. And it is also no coincidence that the countries which don't recognize Israel's existence are the same countries that have extreme and severe persecution of Christians and other religious minorities. In other words, the enemies of Israel are also the enemies of the global Christian community. In conclusion, the creation of a Palestinian state is immoral because the Palestinian leadership is entrenched in the immoral and discriminatory ideologies of Arab fascism and radical Islamism. Now, since the birth of the State of Israel in 1948, Israel has faced many external and military threats from their Arab neighbors, such as Iraq, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Today, Israel faces eternal security threats from Islamist groups who reside in Judea, Samaria, and the Gaza Strip. The creation of a Palestinian state in these regions would violate the rights of many Israelis to live in peace and security. The fear is that if Israel pulls out of these regions, militant groups like Hamas and the Islamic Jihad movement will come to power and launch a brutal war of aggression against Israel. Even though many Israelis have this fear, proponents of the two-state solution will often argue that the creation of a Palestinian state would end Palestinian aggression against Israelis. Well then, this premise is flawed because history presents to us a very different perspective. One must study the Israeli disengagement of Gaza in 2005 to fully understand this. Under the instructions of former Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, Israel pulled out of Gaza in the year of 2005. And eventually, in the year of 2007, the militant group Hamas waged a civil war against the ruling party of that time, which was Fatah, and took control of Gaza. This resulted in Hamas implementing an Islamic theocratic government in Gaza, oppressing the residents there. And rather than focusing on the economic needs of their fellow Gazans, Hamas and their allies, like the Islamic Jihad movement, decided to focus on their fantasy of destroying Israel. Recently, many of you will probably remember this summer, recently in the month of June of 2021, Hamas and their allies launched over 4,000 rockets into Israeli territory. The Hamas regime in Gaza has also built many tunnels into Egypt where they have collected weapons from there, and they have also built many tunnels into Israel where they have killed and kidnapped many Israeli civilians and soldiers. The current situation in Gaza is truly a clear indicator that giving away Judea and Samaria to the Palestinian leadership would be a destructive decision for Israel and its security. Giving away all of Judea and Samaria would create another Gaza-like situation for Israel. Now, the results of the Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip has produced an incredible amount of evidence that giving away the regions of Judea and Samaria to create a Palestinian state would be a fatal decision. There are those, however, who would argue that the creation of a Palestinian state would bring peace and stability to the entire region of the Middle East. Well then, again, this premise is wrong. The Hamas regime in Gaza has not only proven to be a security threat to Israel, but it has also been proven to be a huge security threat to Israel's neighbor to the west, which is the country of Egypt. The insurgency in the Sinai Peninsula started in the year of 2011, when the Arab Spring began in Egypt. Radical Islamist groups and even local Bedouin tribes influenced by Wahhabism took advantage of the political crisis in Egypt and launched multiple rebellions against the Egyptian government in the Sinai Peninsula and also launched multiple terrorist attacks. In January of 2011, the Gaza-based militant group called Army of Islam launched a suicide bombing against Coptic Christians in the city of Alexandria. The Egyptian government arrested a 20-year-old man named Ahmed Lotfi Ibrahim Mohammed, who confessed of being involved with this terrorist attack. He confessed that he was tasked with monitoring Christian and Jewish places of worship for all future terrorist attacks. Eventually, the Egyptian army launched a military campaign against these Islamist rebels in the Sinai Peninsula. And during this military operation, the Egyptian authorities discovered a 2.8 kilometer tunnel stretching from the Gaza Strip to the Sinai Peninsula. This discovery clearly indicated to Egypt that the rebels and the terrorist groups were getting their weapons, supplies, and training from Gaza, which, as we all know, is under the leadership of Hamas. This resulted in Egypt creating a buffer zone between Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula of 500 meters. The Egyptian authorities later added 500 more meters to this buffer zone. Now, the situation between Egypt and the Gaza Strip clearly indicates that if the regions of Judea and Samaria, if the West Bank is given up to create a Palestinian state, Israel's neighbor to the east, which is the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, would also face security problems just like Egypt. In fact, Jordan has much more to fear about a potential Palestinian state. In the early 1970s, Palestinian militant groups in Jordan launched a brutal armed rebellion against the Kingdom of Jordan, infamously known as the Black September War or the Jordanian Civil War. Many of these militants dreamt and spoke openly of taking over Jordan, along with taking over Israel, because Jordan was once part of the British Mandate of Palestine, before the Hashemite royal family was given that land to rule over in 1922 it was given to them by the British in 1922. And for these militants, Palestine is all of the land east and west of the Jordan River. Thus, they were determined to conquer Jordan for themselves. The Black September War of the 1970s is also a clear indication that creating a Palestinian state in these areas of Judea and Samaria would trigger another Black September-like situation in Jordan, since 70% of the Jordanian population is of Palestinian origins. If the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan falls into Palestinian hands, Israel will face a greater security and military threat from the east. The notion of creating a Palestinian state is an idea that is hugely problematic, and thus we as Christians and Jews should oppose it. The founding fathers of Palestinian nationalism were ideologically rooted in the infamous ideologies of Arab fascism and radical Islamism. Some of the founding fathers of Palestinian nationalism were close to the Nazis, such as Hajj Amin Al-Husseini. Their vision of a Palestinian state is an Arab fascist state and an Islamic state that would oppress people who are not ethnically Arab and not religiously Muslim. Creating a Palestinian state would threaten Israel's security and would also be a huge security threat to Israel's neighbors, such as Egypt and Jordan. All of these reasons prove that creating a Palestinian state must be opposed at all costs. Now, the question must be asked, and this is probably coming into your mind, this question, is that if the two-state solution is not the correct solution to end the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then what are the alternative solutions? There are actually several unique solutions to ending this conflict, but I'll be presenting two. So the chairman of the Israeli party, Zehut, his name is Moshe Feiglin, and he advocates a one-state solution that would include a few things. Firstly, the Oslo Accords would be nullified, which would effectively bring an end to the Palestinian Authority. Secondly, Israel would annex the entire regions of Judea and Samaria by restoring Israeli military control and police control over every inch of that land and apply Israeli sovereignty as well. The Arab residents in these regions would be given three options. Option A would help financially and economically help those Arabs who want to immigrate to other countries like Canada, America, or the UK, since the latest surveys, according to Moshe Feiglin, suggest that 60% of the Arabs would like to immigrate to other countries. The Arabs who want to stay in Judea and Samaria would be given option B, which is to have permanent residency. As permanent residents, these Arabs will be able to move freely throughout the land of Israel. The only difference between them and ordinary citizens is that they will not be required to serve in the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and they will not have the right to vote for national elections. However, they will have the right to vote for municipal elections within their own constituency. Option C would be conditional citizenship for Arab residents who seek to truly be loyal to Israel and to the principles of Zionism. Now, Moshe Feiglin advocates for the solution of Gaza would be a military operation where Israel would liberate Gaza from Hamas, annex Gaza as part of Israel proper, and offer the Arabs who live in the Gaza Strip the same three options that he would offer the Arabs who live in the West Bank. Now, there's another alternative, and I believe Charles McVitie, he knows this person. He passed away long ago, Rabbi Benjamin Illaan. And Rabbi Benjamin Illaan's proposal is known as the Illaan Peace Plan. Now, like the Moshe Feiglin's plan, the Illaan Peace Plan advocates a one-state solution, where Israel would annex the entire regions of Judea and Samaria, which again would effectively end the Palestinian Authority. Israel would then launch a military campaign to arrest terrorists and eliminate all terrorist hotbeds within that area. And Israel's sovereignty will be applied to all of Judea and Samaria, and the Arabs would be given permanent residency in Israel, and through negotiations with the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, the Arabs would be given Jordanian citizenship, being that the Arabs who live in the West Bank are culturally very similar to the Arabs who live in Jordan. And historically, they did have Jordanian citizenship until 1988, when the then king of Jordan, King Hussein, took it away from them. In other words, the Arabs of Judea and Samaria would become Jordanian citizens living in Israel. They will live in the land of Israel, but they would vote for national elections in Jordan. All of these alternative solutions are in many ways the only alternatives to solving this conflict. The two-state solution not only ignores the potential immorality of a Palestinian state, it not only ignores the potential security threat of a Palestinian state, but it ultimately ignores God's promise to give the entire land of Israel, to give Eretz Israel to Am Israel, the Jewish people. And to conclude, I will read again Genesis 17, verses 7 to 8. I will confirm my covenant that is between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations. It is a permanent covenant to be your God and the God of your offspring after you. And to you and your future offspring, I will give the land where you are residing, all of the land of Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. Thank you.
Thank you, Abner. All right, so the questions that came in are not softball questions. We have some mean anonymous people here, so feel free if you want to sidestep a question, that's fine. I just want to kind of, the questions came in, so just to ask. So a couple of them are kind of theological questions. I'll actually start with the practical question first. All right, so there's an individual here who is asking about questions of violence of human rights of Palestinians, even to Palestinian Christians. They have a friend in the Middle East who kind of has a very different kind of take on all of this. Obviously, in the nation state of Israel right now, evangelization is not permissible, right? So you can't openly preach the gospel. So with those types of complexities and nuances, how does that kind of fit into your prescription to definitively not have a Palestinian state?
A Palestinian state will only cause violence because ultimately it's about dividing the land. And there's a lot of Palestinians that will often they'll often chant from the river to the sea. Now, a lot of Palestinian Muslims, when they often say that, they do mean destruction of Israel. But a lot of Palestinian Christians, they will not actually mean that. What they mean is that they want access to land. To divide the land of Israel also violates their own rights to that land. In fact, there are a lot of Palestinian Christians who will tell you that they had their mother born in Jaffa or their mother born in Tel Aviv, and they have a right to that land as well. And the Arab presence in the land of Israel is at least, I would say, 700 years old, younger than the Jewish presence, but still they do have a presence in that land. But to claim the idea that they are a unique nationality is wrong. In fact, I would like to tell everyone this. A lot of the countries in the Middle East, Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. All of these countries are artificial. The British and the French, after World War I, after they conquered the Ottoman Empire, when they took over the Middle East, they divided the Middle East up for themselves. So this is why you have countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. So, and the concept of a Palestinian state is also a very fake concept as well. The only real Middle Eastern country that's natural to that land is the country of Israel.
It's a very bold statement. Thank you. All right. So, and this is more of a theological question. So in Ezekiel 47:22, it tells Israel, "You are to consider the foreigner living among you as native born." So what should the ramifications be for non-Jews living in Israel today? Should Arabic Christians be considered native born?
Of course, but you also have to understand there's a complexity to the issue as well. So Israel right now, if we exclude the West Bank and Gaza, Israel has 20% of its population is Arab, and they have citizenship. They vote for the Israeli elections, national and municipal. The problem is not necessarily Arab or the foreigner. The problem is that will be a demographic threat if you decide to give all of the Arabs within the West Bank and Gaza citizenship. And the problem is Israel has Arab parties that are elected. Now, if Israel gave all of the Arabs in the West Bank and Gaza Strip citizenship, they don't need to be violent, but they have the power now to vote Israel out of existence. And there are parties in Israel, like the Ram party, which is in the current coalition government, that has historically had statements where they have said that we want to turn Israel into an Islamic state. You know, so like Ahmed Tibi, one of the other politicians in Israel, has also said that too. So it's not a question of whether or not you're foreign born or not. It's a question of Israel's stability and security. Thank you.
So there's one more question here, and then I have one as well. So maybe I'll start mine first. So right now, you have this kind of amorphous entity, Palestinians. They live in this region. They currently don't have a state. They want to have a state, right? So what would your political prescription be then? How to deal with this population? Like, what should they do?
What should they do? Well, there's also another solution that I did not mention, and that was Naftali Bennett's solution, where he would basically annex because right now the West Bank is divided into three areas, areas A, B, and C. So areas A and B fully controlled by the Palestinian Authority. Area C is under Israeli military control. So what Naftali Bennett has stated that he would annex Area C, and the Arabs in Area C would have a full-blown citizenship, or they would have permanent residency, depending on the situation. The Arabs who live in areas A and B, they would have freedom of movement to move anywhere in Israel as long as they do not violate any sort of security for Israel. But going back to another solution that I want to mention is, I think the best one is permanent residency. Because as a permanent resident in Israel, you can move anywhere in Israel. You know, for example, in the Golan Heights, you have the Druze. A lot of them don't want Israeli citizenship because they still have loyalties to Syria, but nevertheless, they have permanent residency. They can move anywhere from the Golan Heights to Tel Aviv, to Jerusalem, to Negev Desert, anywhere. So I think the best solution is permanent residency and potentially citizenship when Israel feels safe that is right.
Okay. And then the last question, and I have a pretty good idea who asked this, but I'm going to ask it. All right. So from a theological standpoint, we've had many speakers that have said the Gentiles have now been grafted into this olive branch, right? So if that is true, then the Gentile Christians that are grafted into the Jewish olive branch, do they now have a right to the land? Because the Jews have a right to the land, and the Christians have been grafted in. So do they now have a right to the land? Why or why not?
Of course they're grafted in, but the question is not about the Arab Christians. The question is about Islam and the Muslims. Because ultimately, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is a theological war between Israel and the Islamic world. Iran doesn't care. They always say that we want to nuke Israel off the face of the earth. And it's not like they care about Palestinian rights and that kind of stuff. It's for theological reasonings. And back to your question, of course they are we are grafted in, but the question is not about Christians, it's about Muslims. That's the real problem here.
And just to be clear, I'm sorry I grilled you up here. I agree, and I think that the main issue for a Palestinian state is always with an Islamic state in view, right? There's no movement that's calling for a Palestinian Christian state, right? So you stood up well to the tests and darts of fire put at us by our crowd.